Randal Quarles, the Federal Reserve's Vice Chair for Supervision, arrives at the swearing-in of Fed Chairman, Jerome Powell, right. Aaron P. Bernstein/Reuters. Good Monday. Here's what we're watching. Fed is working on material changes to Volcker rule. Will Quarles end the post-Volcker quiet? Big foreign banks and the Senate's deregulation bill. S.MP. 500 futures are down amid tariff threats and Italy's election results. How Washington intervened in Broadcom's bid for Qualcomm. The school protection industry is seeing business get busier. Want this in your inbox every morning? Sign up here. Fed is working on material changes to Volcker rule. Changes are coming to the so-called Volcker rule, the post-financial crisis era measure intended to rein in aggressive trading by Wall Street banks. The Federal Reserve is in the process of working with other regulatory agencies to make material changes to the rule. Randal K. Quarles, the Fed's Vice Chair for Supervision, said the central bank is working toward rewriting portions of the Volcker rule during a speech on Monday. Mr. Quarles took issue with many parts of the rule, inspired by Paul Volcker, a former Federal Reserve chairman. Mr. Quarles said the rule was an example of a complex regulation that is not working well, and that the Fed is working on revisions to make the rule less burdensome to firms that do not have large trading desks. Mr. Quarles did not give a time frame to revise the rule but said the Fed's goal was to write something that would formally be submitted for public comment. He said regulators want to make clearer and more transparent what kind of trading is governed by the Volcker rule, something he said has been a source of frustration for regulators and bankers. The Volcker rule has been credited with curtailing the ability of banks to make risky and speculative trades for their own account, which some contend contributed to some of the excesses that led up to the financial crisis of a decade ago. Matthew Goldstein. Will Quarles end the post-Volcker quiet? The Federal Reserve is gearing up for a far-reaching overhaul of the Volcker rule. The rule's critics, including Randal K. Quarles, head of supervision at the Fed, say it is too burdensome on banks. But there may be one group of people who hope that the Fed doesn't get the rule: investors in bank stocks. Since the Volcker rule took effect in 2015, they've been able to worry much less about traders saddling their institutions with overwhelming losses. In fact, there hasn't been a big trading meltdown at a large United States bank since the London whale debacle at JP Morgan Chase, which happened prior to 2015 and arguably lit a fire under regulators to finalize the rule. Contrary to some analyses of the financial crisis, proprietary trading contributed to the weakness of financial system. Who can forget Morgan Stanley's disastrous subprime wager that saddled the bank with $9 billion of losses? And by shutting proprietary traders, banks may have dodged no end of bullets. When a star commodities trader, Andrew J. Hall, left Citigroup, there was concern that the bank lost a crucial moneymaker. But the hedge fund Mr. Hall ran after he left Citigroup suffered outsized losses. And the list of bank traders who later racked up big losses at hedge funds is not short. Peter Eves Nordstrom rebuffs bid. The retailer has rejected its founding family's takeover offer. A group of Nordstrom family members, which control 21% of the company, had offered $50 a share for the shares it does not already own. The special committee has directed its advisors and management not to provide further due diligence information to the group. Furthermore, unless the group can promptly and substantially improve the price it is proposing to pay for the company, the special committee intends to terminate discussions. Deutsche Bank's headquarters in Frankfurt, Daniel Roland/Agence France Presse, Getty Images. What do big foreign banks get out of the new banking bill? It was a brash move, even by Wall Street's standards. Deutsche Bank, a giant German bank with a big trading business in the United States, took emergency loans from the Federal Reserve during the financial crisis a decade ago. But later, Deutsche Bank changed the legal classification of its Wall Street operations, a step that for a time shielded it from United States banking regulations. Deutsche Bank's actions, and those of other large foreign banks during that period, now loom over a piece of banking deregulation legislation that the Senate may approve this week. The bill loosens the part of the Dodd-Frank Act, the 2010 overhaul of the United States financial system, that imposed stricter regulations on larger banks, including foreign ones. Specifically, the bill, sponsored by Senator Mike Crapo, Republican of Idaho, would lighten the regulation of banks that have less than $250 billion in loans, securities and other assets, a group that includes American banks like SunTrust and BB&T. but the bill's critics are concerned that it would allow far larger foreign banks to chip away at rules designed to prevent them wriggling out of United States safeguards. The authors of the new bill reject such fears. Folks are peddling a lot of misinformation about our bipartisan bill, but if you look at the bill text you will see that large foreign banks will be subject to the same enhanced prudential standards. Senator Jon Tester, Democrat of Montana, said in a statement, "Our legislation provides targeted regulatory relief for local lenders in Montana and rural America. Enhanced prudential standards is the regulatory term for stricter rules." And the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome H. Powell, speaking before a Senate committee last week, said he did not think the bill would allow foreign banks to operate under a softer set of rules. Mr. Powell based his assertion on how Dodd-Frank is written. It states that banks over $50 billion in consolidated assets require stricter oversight. The new bill moves that up to $250 billion, but even though the likes of Deutsche Bank, UBS and Credit Suisse have less than $250 billion in United States assets, they have far more than that on a consolidated basis around the world. And since the new bill does not amend the part of Dodd-Frank that requires regulators to use consolidated assets, the Fed can continue to apply its enhanced regulations to foreign banks. So, why are opponents of the bill, like Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat of Ohio, concerned? They point to remarks made by Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin in Congress earlier this year, when Senator Brown asked Mr. Mnuchin if he believed the new bill would reduce regulations for foreign banks. He said, "That is correct. Indeed, the Treasury, when it set out its aims in a report last year for reducing financial regulations, included relief for foreign banks." A Treasury official on Monday sought to clarify Mr. Mnuchin's answer to Senator Brown. The official said Mr. Mnuchin was responding to the senator's remarks about the Treasury's report that came before his question about the impact of Senator Crapo's bill. Critics also point out that the Fed in part based its post-crisis rules for foreign banks on language in Dodd-Frank that required the rules establish fair competition between foreign and domestic banks. If the bill passes, and the Fed gives foreign banks no relief from certain regulations, the foreign banks could argue in a lawsuit that they are competitively disadvantaged against American banks with assets under $250 billion that did get such relief. Some opponents of the bill contend, and the Fed did in one place veer from using consolidated assets when applying regulations to foreign banks. The Fed in 2014 said that foreign banks with less than $50 billion in United States assets, not a global consolidated measure, would be eligible for less stringent requirements under its foreign banking rule. That could create the grounds for raising that bar for lighter regulation from to $250 billion from $50 billion. Critics of the bill argue, but supporters of the bill contend that United States laws give the Fed substantial leeway to continue applying stricter regulation to foreign banks. What might happen if Senator Crapo's bill passes? It seems unlikely that big foreign banks are going to get an immediate pass from stricter regulations, but the pre-crisis period shows that, over a longer period, banks and their lawyers press for changes when they see regulators relax. Peter Eves-Hofdan, Chief Executive of Broadcom, Lucas Jackson/Reuters national security throws a wrench into Broadcom's plans. The most dramatic story in M.A. has taken another twist, one that raises questions about how assertively the Trump administration will regulate deal-making. What happened? The U.S. government panel that reviews deals for national security concerns, known as CFIUS, has asked Qualcomm to postpone its shareholder meeting, scheduled for tomorrow, by 30 days so it could further review Broadcom's hostile takeover bid. Broadcom's response pulled no punches, accusing Qualcomm of covertly reaching out to regulators. This was a blatant, desperate attack by Qualcomm to entrench its incumbent board of directors and prevent its own stockholders from voting for Broadcom's independent director nominees. Why? Members of CFIUS have asked whether the takeover could put the U.S. behind China in the race for 5G wireless technology. Qualcomm's biggest rival in the space is Huawei, and Qualcomm has argued that Broadcom, a serial acquirer and noted cost-cutter, could hurt crucial 5G research and development. And Michael noted on Friday that there's more to it than that. Where the vote stands, many early votes favored Broadcom. The shareholder advisory firms ISS and Glass Lewis recommended giving it at least 4 seats, but a top 30 investor, Parnassus, had said it supported Qualcomm. Michael hears that both sides have been especially focused on lobbying the biggest shareholders, BlackRock and Vanguard. The bigger picture: the White House has already blocked the sale of a U.S. tech company to a Chinese buyer on national security grounds. If it steps in here, in an unusually aggressive move by CFI US, which normally acts after a proposed deal is filed for review, would dealmakers lose heart? The deals fly around. AXA of France agreed to buy the XL Group, a reinsurer, for $15.3 billion in cash, the biggest takeover of a U.S. insurer by a European one. AXA cybersecurity due diligence is rising up acquirers. M.A. Checklists. Wall Street Journal: Siemens is forging ahead with an IPO of its healthcare unit, Healthineers, that could value it at as much as $38 billion. Bloomberg: Zagat gets a new owner. The infatuation is set to announce on Monday that it has bought Zagat from Google. From Michael Delamer said, the deal would bolster the profile of the 9-year-old The Infatuation, but it also raises questions about whether Zagat, once the 800-pound gorilla of restaurant recommendations, can remain relevant when a slew of younger digital competitors have emerged and thrived. Background: then Google bought Zagat 7 years ago under the direction of Marissa Mayer, who went on to become Yahoo's chief executive. The plan was to integrate it into its mapping service, but life under Google has sometimes been rocky for the business, including a de-emphasizing of Zagat content in favor of Google's own collected recommendations. About The Infatuation: the company was founded 9 years ago by Chris Stong and Andrew Steinfeld, who a way to recommend restaurants and bars to their friends. The company has succeeded in part by embracing technologies both new and old. It popularized #8s as a branded hashtag on Instagram, and runs a slew of food-related accounts on the social network. It also rolled out TextRax, a texting recommendation service staffed by humans to recommend eateries for users' particular situations. The company said it became profitable last year. Trump hasn't backed down on tariffs. White House officials like Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross and Senior Trade Advisor Peter Navarro asserted on the Sunday talk shows that tariffs on steel and aluminum are definitely coming, though they didn't say when, and the move may affect more than raw metal either. Mr. Trump threatened tariffs on cars imported from the EU if it retaliates. He didn't mention the ones that Daimler and BMW make in GOP-leaning southern states. Big question 1: how will China react? So far, it has been cautious, in part because Chinese steel makes up just 2% of American steel imports. U.S. allies who stand to be hit have been far more outspoken. Big question 2: will Gary Cohn, who favors free trade but was shot down at a meeting on Thursday, finally leave the White House? The tariffs fly around. The Wall Street Journal editorial board says steel and aluminum jobs will not return, because they were destroyed by productivity gains, not imports. Wall Street Journal: how tariffs divide blue-collar America. NYT: what they could do to the cost of Mr. Trump's infrastructure proposal. Wall Street Journal: Carl Icahn sold 26% of his stake in Manitowoc, a crane manufacturer that uses plenty of steel, before the Commerce Department recommended new tariffs. Students inside a ballistic shelter. Nick Oxford for the New York Times: how the school protection industry is thriving in the wake of the Parkland school shooting. Companies have been rushing to sell security products from metal detectors and remote locking doors to body armor to threat parsing Twitter bots. More from Tiffany Shu of the NEET: last year, sales of security equipment and services to the education sector reached $2.7 billion, up from $2.5 billion in 2015. According to data from IHS Markit. After the Parkland shooting, demand is surging. Right now, there's going to be a lot of appropriations dollars being sent to school districts without a lot of oversight, said Curtis S. Lavarello, executive director of the School Safety Advocacy Council. A fintech company makes a stand. Cabbage, a small business lender that counts SoftBank and UPS as investors, said this morning that it won't work with companies that sell guns to those under 21 or make or sell assault-style rifles. Elsewhere in guns, why the AR-15 became America's rifle. How Goldman Sachs is tied to a major gun seller, Bass Pro Shops. Why some pension funds hesitate to sell gun company holdings, and why it's hard for Florida to pass gun control laws. The policy fly around. Robert Mueller is investigating George Nader, a Lebanese-American businessman and advisor to the UAE. The special counsel has also subpoenaed at least one witness for all communications regarding 10 people, including President Trump, Steve Bannon and the former campaign advisor Carter Page. The State Department has yet to spend any of the $120 million it has been allocated since late 2016 to counter foreign meddling in U.S. elections. NYT How European leaders are responding to the possibility that President Xi Jinping of China may threaten the global system, rather than defend it. NYT Mr. Trump is seeking to block federal funding for new rail tunnels under the Hudson River as part of a feud with Chuck Schumer. NYT A businessman who recently purchased a majority stake in the only Trump hotel in Latin America wants to push the Trump family out, but they're refusing to go. NYT Amaral Fiki for the New York Times How big banks want to further undercut Dodd-Frank. They're arguing that an exemption in the way regulators calculate the overall riskiness of banks' portfolios, known as the supplemental leverage ratio, should apply to them as well as to custody banks like Bank of New York Mellon and State Street. More from Emily Flitter, Ken Vogel and Alan Rappaport of the Needs Citigroup and JP Morgan argue that the exemption is not fair. They say that since they, too, take deposits from other banks and stash them at the Fed, they should get the same relief, even though that is not the primary focus of their business. Lobbyists for the two banks are hoping to persuade lawmakers to change the bill to allow all banks that accept custodial deposits to take advantage of the exemption, according to people familiar with the bank's efforts. Elsewhere in financial services, how Greg Fleming plans to reshape the Rockefellers' personal fortune into the next investment giant. Telegram's founder, Pavel Durov, Jim Wilson / The New York Times Who's in and Who's Out of Telegram's I.C.O.in, Benchmark, Sequoia Partners, and Kleiner Perkins, out, veteran virtual currency investors like Union Square Ventures, Andreessen Horowitz, and Polychain Capital. Why? Telegram's promises to fix the problems with initial coin offerings sound nebulous to many investors at the moment. It's a pitch that sounds good to VCs that haven't participated but makes no sense to people that have been in the space. Nick Tomaino of the investment fund One Confirmation told the Need the Tech fly around Uber took billions of dollars from SoftBank. Now it must fight the other ride-hailing companies that the Japanese conglomerate owns stakes in. Wall Street Journal exchanges remain a weak point for the virtual currency ecosystem. Wall Street Journal thanks to deepfake video technology that puts one person's face on another's body, our columnist Kevin Roose can become Ryan Gosling, sort of. NYT Silicon Valley is over, says Silicon Valley, as VCS tour the Midwest. NYT back in the Bay Area. Professionals are moving into dorms. Neath the Oscars fly around. The Academy Awards became a mini Super Bowl, a showcase for major ad spots. Twitter, for instance, rolled out an ad about female empowerment and the hashtag here we are. Here's how the Oscars address the age of #MeToo, and an explainer of the inclusion rider that Frances McDormand mentioned in her acceptance speech for Best Actress. A co-founder of the VC firm General Catalyst won an Oscar, Dan Primack of Axios pointed out. David Falcow, who was a producer of the Netflix documentary Icarus, at Dan Primack all the winners from last night. Niche Revolving Door Index Ventures has hired Sarah Cannon from Alphabet Capital as its first woman partner in the U.S. Recode Albertsons and Rite Aid named Jim Donald, the former Starbucks CEO, as the president and chief operating officer of their newly combined company. Wall Street Journal The Speak read reducing the gender pay gap would have large economic benefits, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, if all OECD matched Sweden on this. It could increase gross domestic product by $6 trillion. Bloomberg, the chief executive of Credit Suisse, has written to a woman who made a sexual harassment complaint in 2010 to promise a thorough review of how the bank handled it. FT buyout bosses are taking on more risk, paying record prices for assets and taking on debt at levels close to the peaks of a decade ago. FT Bacardi is reviving an old promotional technique, sending its employees into bars. NYT Philip Picardi, a former intern who now leads Teen Vogue, could be the feature of Condé Nast. NYT A former LVMH executive is planning a fashion hub in his home city of Detroit. NYT Berkshire Hathaway's real estate brokerage network is adding its first international franchisee, in Berlin. Wall Street Journal. We'd love your feedback. Please email thoughts and suggestions to bizday@nytimes.com.